Hello, I'm Richard Davies, and welcome to another episode of How Do We Fix It, where we discuss and consider ideas from across the political divide. And as Francis Collins said in last week's episode, boy, do we need more of that. This is our latest report on the work, ideas, and people of Braver Angels, America's largest volunteer-led citizens group that's working across the country to push back against polarization. Today, I'll speak with one of the movement's co-founders, Braver Angels President, David Blankenhorn.
I don't do this work in optimism. I do it in hope. This is what needs to be done. If we're going to have any chance to fix this and save our country, this is what needs to be done. We do not any longer effectively communicate with one another as citizens. Now, that's a big statement, but the more you think about it and the more you look at how we're working today, I really think it's true.
Our show is about fixes.
Yeah, how to make the world a better place.
How do we fix it?
How do we fix it?
So this is the first of a two-part deep dive interview with David Blankenhorn. Nearly 8 years ago, Braver Angels was co-founded by David, along with Bill Doherty and David Lapp. 2 years after its founding, Braver Angels had its first convention, attended by 72 conservative and 72 liberal delegates. There have been many other gatherings since. In the past few years, red-blue workshops, debates, and other events have been held in all 50 states. Let's begin our conversation. David Blankenhorn of Braver Angels, welcome to How Do We Fix It?
Thank you, Richard. Great to be with you.
Let's start with the origin story of Braver Angels. How did it start? Why did you think there was a need for it at the time?
It started soon after the 2016 election. The country was pretty upset. There was a huge amount of rancor and distress in the world. I was living on the Upper West Side of New York, and my friend David Lapp was living in Warren County in Southwest Ohio. We talked to each other the day after the election. And I said, how are things in Southwest Ohio? He said, things are pretty good. 70% in the county went for Trump. People are feeling good. He said, how are things on the Upper West Side of Manhattan? I said, oh, people feel that they've been shot. You know, what's happened to the country? What's going on? Really distress and anger. And so we decided to, 3 weeks from that day, that we would bring together 10 people in Warren County who had just voted for Trump and 10 who had just voted for Clinton. And we would spend a weekend together over the course of a weekend and try to talk to each other, instead of about each other. And we did. It was a transformative experience for us, for everybody. Some of these people are still involved in Braver Angels. And yeah, that was the origin. I mean, we've had hundreds of these things now, thousands actually around the country. And that was the first thing we did.
Why? Why did you do this? Why did you think there was a need to bring people together from different tribes, different points of view?
I've pretty much spent my life doing that kind of work, since I was 16 years old. I've never really done much else except try to form organizations that would try to bring people together who might not be together. It started in Mississippi with black and white high school students. So I've kind of had it in my bones all my life, really. But usually it'd just been around issue by issue. But starting in the, around early, 2012, 13, 14, it was increasingly clear, not just to me, but I think to everybody, that polarization was just kind of taking over all the issues, It wasn't just one or two issues that we were polarized about. It was everything. And so no matter what issue you wanted to deal with, you had this breakdown of this animosity between two groups. And so that was the idea for Braver Angels, that we would deal directly with the issue of polarization rather than just issue by issue. It wasn't really disagreeing about issues that was the main thing. Americans disagree about issues less than they think they do, generally speaking. What they don't like is each other. It's the other people they don't like and trust. They say not only are you wrong about an issue, but you're a bad person.
But very often they don't know the people they disagree with.
They know them by stereotype, and they know them by what they see on news programs, and they know them by social media talk. So yeah, they don't know them at all.
So what happened in that first meeting in Warren County, Ohio, with 10 people who'd voted for Trump and 10 people who'd voted for Hillary Clinton in the 2016 election?
We found out that we kind of liked each other. I know that sounds trite, but these are people who really thought that the people who had voted for the other candidate it was incomprehensible, to people who's incomprehensible why anybody would vote for Trump, or incomprehensible why anybody would vote for Clinton. That sense of recognition of the other, that these are human beings that kind of walk and talk like you. They have families. They have certain values that you can recognize. They have personal stories that you can relate to. So it was really the issue of finding a kind of civic friendship that was there, despite political disagreements that were really deep.
Is that what you thought would happen?
I didn't know. It was an experiment to see if we could actually talk to each other. We had just gone through an incredibly rancorous political campaign. People were really on edge about this. But I think in the entire campaign, there were almost no examples of people talking to one another about, people from different sides talking to one another. The candidates didn't. They just had, no one did. So we thought, well, what an amazing thing. After all this, it's amazing what happens when people will talk to each other.
And that was soon after the 2016 election. And here we are in 2024.
Right.
So what's happened with Braver Angels First? I should say that you changed your name from Better Angels to Braver Angels.
Right. Well, what's happened is that as the country has gotten even more polarized, as things are in so many ways continuing to on a spiral into this world of animosity toward each other, Braver Angels has grown to be a national organization. We have 102 chapters around the country. We have about 3,400 trained volunteers who run these until that we ran the first. We now have, there'll be several happening tonight somewhere, by trained volunteers who do this. We have a national network of state and regional leaders. We have an annual convention. The last one we had 750 people from around the country attended. So it's a grassroots organization. It's growing, and we just haven't gotten big enough to turn the tide yet.
What are those meetings like? I mean, you say there'll be 2 or 3 meetings perhaps tonight. Any given night?
Any given night.
Yeah. What happens in those meetings?
Usually 7 or 8 conservatives, we use the term red, and 7 or 8 Democrats or progressives or liberals, and we call them blue. So about equal numbers on both sides. There are 2 moderators. The first thing will happen after the preliminaries is each group will meet on their own to talk about what they think the other group thinks about them. And the question is, what stereotypes do you think the other group has about you? And they make a list. And the purpose of that is to just get all this out on the table right away. Plus, they can say what the opponents are calling us. They know. So they make the list, and then they say, okay, why are those things stereotypes? What makes them exaggerated or incorrect? And they go through each one. And then the third thing is, this is the hard part, is there any kernel of truth to any of this? Is there, even though they're wrong, even though you don't like them, is there anything there that has a little bit of touch of, a little validity to it? And you go through that too. Then they get together and talk about it. And it's an amazing thing to see because all the bad things are right out there on the table. They talk both about why they think it's not right to be called a baby killer if you're a Democrat. And then they say, well, is there a kernel of truth? One of the most amazing things that happened in that first meeting, the conservatives always say that the main thing they get called is racist, which is true. So the guy reporting out says, well, we don't think we're racists. But the kernel of truth is we are willing to admit that most conservatives are not racists, but most racists are conservatives. And you just could have heard a pin drop. Because all of a sudden, they're saying something that's real. And it's not just about, we hate you for calling us bad names. And the same thing happens on the other side too. So the purpose of that part of the day that they're spending together is to listen to people you don't agree with, but also to look inward and not just have a defensive crouch all the time.
I got to ask you, the conservatives are called racist by liberals. What's the one big thing that liberals are called by conservatives?
That varies a little bit more. It's almost always racist for conservatives. Liberals often get called people that want the government to give everybody things. That's a very common thing. Baby killers is way high up on the list.
In reference to abortion.
Abortion, yeah. And but I would say the main one is the government takes care of you. The government gives you stuff. And that's what they don't like.
We're having a conversation with David Blankenhorn, president and co-founder of Braver Angels. I'm Richard Davies. This is the first of a pair of episodes with David. We'll have more in a few moments, but first an appeal to you, dear listeners, because you can help us. We're not asking for money, but we do want a little love. Subscribe to How Do We Fix It, rate us, and review us wherever you get podcasts. This really helps spread the word, not only about these shows, but also the work of Braver Angels. Now back to my next question. This podcast, How Do We Fix It, started around the same time as Braver Angels began. Oh. And I'm often asked, have you fixed it yet?
Have you? You need another week or so?
And clearly the answer is no.
Yeah.
What do you say to people when they go, well, okay, you formed this organization and America's possibly more polarized than ever, or at least in our living memory?
Yes. Well, it's true. The challenge we face is to recognize the problem and try as citizens to do something about it. And I know one thing that's not going to fix it is the citizens being passive and waiting for the political leaders to fix it. I can promise you that's not going to happen. The only way that things really change in America in a basic way is if we, the people, the citizens, do things. And so that's what we're trying to do. And are we going to succeed? I don't know. Václav Havel said there's a difference between hope and optimism. Optimism is believing that what you're going to do will work out. Hope is believing that what you need to do needs to be done regardless of how it works out. So I don't do this work in optimism. I do it in hope. This is what needs to be done. If we're going to have any chance to fix this and save our country, this is what needs to be done.
How bad are things now? How much of a collapse of our public conversation has there been?
Well, it might have been worse in earlier moments in our history. Probably in the 1850s in the lead up to the Civil War was probably worse. In the late 1960s when the issues were Vietnam and race, it was highly, highly polarized, lots of violence during that period. So it's not like we're any stranger to this. But what's distinctive, I think, about polarization now is it's not just about one or two issues. We just don't like each other about almost everything. What we're eating, how we dress. I mean, and it's pretty deep. Most Americans now just have very cold feelings about people in the other party. Disliking people over being a different political opinion is now way outrunning disliking people because being from a different race.
Or a different religion.
Or a different religion. Large numbers of Americans will say, if the other side wins the next presidential election, our country could come to an end. So those are strong statements. And, you maybe take some of that with a grain of salt. But let's just say this. Our country is divided into two basic groups that really, really don't trust each other. And in a democracy such as ours, if the citizens don't like or trust each other, if the citizens aren't connected by what Lincoln called bonds of affection, then the whole thing grinds to a halt. Self-government requires a certain ability for citizens to care about one another and to trust one another. When that goes down the tubes, we're in big trouble.
You gave a very moving speech, I thought, to the Braver Angels Convention in late June of this year in Kenosha, Wisconsin. And you quoted Hannah Arendt.
Right.
I guess you'd call her a political philosopher.
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
And she said, dark times stem from a collapse of public conversation.
That sentence really stood out to me when I read it, because she goes on to say that dark times, by which she means when people feel like things are really going badly. And that's another thing. So many Americans feel like, boy, we are not on the right track. That's what she calls dark times. It's usually associated with rises in violence and other big changes. And she says it's not because of the problems themselves. That's what's so interesting. It's not because the problems are so big that we don't know how to solve them, or we've gotten stupid all of a sudden, or the problems are so new that we haven't. It's none of those things. It's because we do not any longer effectively communicate with one another as citizens. Now, that's a big statement. But the more you think about it and the more you look at how we're working today, I really think it's true. I think it really comes down to our increasing incapacity to have meaningful conversation with people who are different from us politically. And if you look around, do you see it happening on TV? Never. Do you see it happening in political life? Never. Almost never. Do you see it happening on college campuses? Increasingly less. Churches? No, we're increasingly segregated when we go to church or synagogue or mosque. Do we do it with our neighbors? Less and less. Because usually now, today, compared to earlier generations, people usually live in communities where people tend to think alike.
It's interesting you use that word segregation, because when I was a kid, probably when you were a kid, when we heard the word segregation, we inevitably said, oh, that's racial segregation.
Well, that's certainly the way I thought about it, too. I'm from Mississippi. We are segregating ourselves very strongly. Take the issue of political parties. There was a time not too long ago when you could find conservative Democrats and liberal Republicans. Those people, they're not there anymore. Almost not there. There would be a time when you would bump into people at the local supermarket who were really different than you educationally. Not so much, much rarer. Most Americans now live in what they call landslide counties, where whoever wins by a landslide. 50 years ago, most Americans did not live in landslide counties. So when you went to the post office or went to the PTA or, you were bumping shoulders with people who had a different point of view about who should be the next president. Much less so now.
David Blankenhorn. The second half of our interview will be in the next episode. Before co-founding Braver Angels, David led the Institute for American Values, a think tank on civil society. He founded the Mississippi Community Service Corps, the Virginia Community Service Corps, and the Committee for Economic Change at Harvard University. He co-founded the National Fatherhood Initiative and is the author of 5 books, including In Search of Braver Angels, Getting Along Together in Troubled Times. Before we end this episode, let's spend a few minutes with Jessie Manisto. She's the director of debates for Braver Angels, and we spoke with Jessie and Luke Nathan Phillips back in July outside the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee. We were planning to do the same thing for this episode after the Democratic Convention. So why was it so much harder to speak with delegates and demonstrators, including pro-Palestinian protesters, right outside the hall in Chicago than it had been in Milwaukee? I asked Jessie.
There wasn't that much going on outside of the convention, which is where we as Braver Angels volunteers were often located. Some of us got in, some of us got credentials to go inside, but walking around in the city of Chicago was almost eerie at this convention, around this convention. The only sign that I saw that anything out of the ordinary was going on was the number of emergency vehicles, police cars that I saw zooming by with their lights flashing. There was very tight security. I went out looking for protesters. I couldn't find them. I wandered around Millennium Park. The Starbucks across the street told me, I think there's going to be something, and there wasn't. It was downright eerie. So I was there, but apart from talking to a few people about Braver Angels, I didn't engage that much.
I suppose that's partially because protesters promised many thousands of people in the streets of Chicago, and the police prepared for it, and the Democratic Party convention was kind of locked down because of the security threat.
That's exactly what it seemed like.
Wow. So I guess kind of disappointing for you.
Yes, part of it was, but we also did some debates while we were there. We did some regular Braver Angels stuff. So the usual thing, the Chicagoland Alliance is a great group of people. I'm really glad I got to spend time with them. But as far as the DNC, which was our topic that we were going to discuss, I don't have much except to say what a surreal experience it was to be in Chicago outside of it.
Because there was so little going on in the streets.
That's right. Sometimes it felt like a ghost town. I've been to Chicago many times. It's just, where is everybody?
So before we go, tell me just a little bit about the Braver Angels debate that you did and how that compares with other events that you organize, because you're the head of debates at Braver Angels.
We ran 2 different debates. I chaired what we would call a grassroots community debate, and Luke chaired a Coliseum debate on which I spoke as a panelist. And so we were happy to be there and just run 2 of our different offerings. The grassroots debate was on the topic that Braver Angels has chosen at our convention in June in Kenosha, where we've chosen to devote our resources, our time and energy to the topic of immigration. And so coming in as someone who lives in Washington, D.C., I don't know the local Chicago concerns about immigration, but this was a local debate. So I said to them, all right, I'm here to run this debate. What should we talk about immigration? I know that's our topic, but what should the resolution be? And some of the most fun we had in this debate was adding something to it, which was, as a group, deciding the actual question that split the room. And this was a very blue group, to use the Braver Angels language. This was around the Democratic National Convention. And the resolution we ended up coming up with was resolved: Chicago should be a sanctuary city. And people found themselves on surprising sides of that resolution. But it did split the room, and it got a otherwise mostly blue, not exclusively blue crowd talking in a really constructive way. And so people enjoyed the debate. They told me they also really enjoyed the process of just figuring out what the right question was.
Well, we'd love to have you back in a future episode of How Do We Fix It, talking about Braver Angels debates and what makes them so special and different from, say, a presidential or vice presidential debate that we're going to be hearing a lot about in the coming weeks.
Oh, I would love to come back and talk to you about any sort of debate. We're also looking at things we can do around the presidential and vice presidential debates, which are not the same kind of debates we run, but I'd love to chat with you about any of it anytime, Richard.
Great. Thanks very much, Jesse.
Thanks for having me.
Jesse Manisto on How Do We Fix It. Our show page is at our website, which is howdowefixit.me. Our most excellent producer and sound designer is Miranda Schaefer. I'm Richard Davies. Thanks for listening.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group.